All right. Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I am an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. Temple of the Silver Star is a modern mystery school. We offer structured training in magic, mysticism, divination, astrology, Kabbalah, and a variety of other aspects of the contemporary Western esoteric tradition. We offer structured training both in our academic and our initiatory tracks. And at the end of this presentation, I'll give you some contact information and our website address if you'd like to learn more about the Temple of the Silver Star or you'd like to consider making an application. So tonight we'll be doing I'm going to be doing a kind of ongoing classes on the first Monday evenings of every month, probably 6 p.m. Pacific. I haven't heard from anyone that slight adjustments in that time would be helpful, so I'll probably just continue with this. I'll be doing kind of one-off standalone classes, at least for a while. So just to be on the lookout for announcements. There'll be a separate Zoom link for each class. So yeah, be on the lookout for announcements for next month's and following month's classes. So tonight we're talking about probably the most basic fundamental topic within Thelema, do what thou wilt, the law of liberty. So here we have the two primary, we'll see some other statements relating to this law as well, but here we have the primary statement, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and then the statement that generally accompanies this, love is the law, love under will. These are so fundamental to Thelema that they are even used as greetings. We frequently begin formal communications with do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and then sign off, love is the law, love under will. So you can obviously see how extremely important they are. Now, I imagine that most people listening to this talk already have some basic familiarity with these concepts, so I don't want to spend too much time on the basics. I assume a lot of you are already kind of working on this and trying to figure out what this means for your life, what it means for your relationships to other people, to the world, to society, and how to actually walk the path that is living a life in conformity with this will. So what I want to do here tonight is, well, several disclaimers, I guess here. First of all, I absolutely do not want to tell you what this means or how to think about it. These quotations in particular, not only is it so personal and individual, but these quotations are drawn from the Book of the Law. And while I don't think there's any need for any kind of superstition or anything like that about it, but we do generally follow the tradition of not directly commenting or openly interpreting the book, which gives everyone space to interpret and to understand it for themselves. And I think it's also very nice and important that we share a text rather than sharing a particular interpretation of a text, and that there's room for many different understandings of what that text means. So I'll do my best to refrain from, we'll see a number of different quotations from the Book of the Law. I'll do my best to refrain from directly interpreting that, but I'm sure you'll be able to tell as we go through kind of indirectly how I'm understanding different things. Please just know that that's only my personal understanding and only one of many. There's so much to talk about on this subject that tonight will just be a very partial, kind of fragmentary presentation of some of the things that right now I think about this. So please just keep all of that in mind. And as you're listening, I hope my only intention here would be that the things we'll talk about tonight would be prompts for your own thinking about this, and that it's only helpful to give you maybe new perspectives, maybe a way of thinking about some of these things that you haven't thought of before, and that you then use that to arrive at your own conclusions and your own understanding. I'm not trying to advocate any particular interpretation or ethical theory, or certainly any political theory or anything like that. So with that out of the way, let's go a little further into this here. So the word will, we're talking about do what thou wilt, and love under will. The word will in Greek is thelema. We'll see a little bit more about this word as we go on, but obviously you can see that because the sort of philosophical or religious or spiritual or whatever you want to call it, this particular tradition that we are a part of here is called Thelema, which means will. Again, I think we can obviously see how absolutely central importance this concept of will is. So yeah, so one way I think of thinking about the will, and this is a common understanding, I'm sure you all know, that the basic distinction that's often made, that do what thou wilt doesn't mean you do whatever you want, right? That by will, we're referring to something deeper than simply desire or whim or something like that. So I thought we could bring in a little bit of astrological symbolism here to talk about this, and that we could look at sort of will as a solar principle, contrasted with desire as a lunar principle here. We can also associate will, and so here we're attributing the will to the soul, or again, if you are not comfortable with the word soul, people talk about the higher self, the deeper self, or sort of self with a capital S. As opposed to the personality, which you might also call the ego. I think the word ego is misused a lot, so I generally try to avoid using it. Everyone has an ego in the sense that we all have personalities. The ego is the individual consciousness. I think a lot of ideas about sort of transcending the ego or having left the ego behind are often, I think, dangerously misleading. We all have egos insofar as we are individual persons. Perhaps in an actual state of complete unitary consciousness, perhaps in that state, we don't have an ego, but when we're interacting in the world, interacting as individual people, we all have an ego or a personality. So if we wanted to look at this in kind of from a reincarnation sort of model, we could say that the will, like the soul, is the thing that persists across incarnations, whereas personalities are like bodies. They are born and they die. They're subject to, in Aristotelian terms, generation and corruption, coming to be and passing away. They are impermanent and changeable, while underneath those things, the will persists. Because it is never born and never dies. It is eternal. So I think this is one way of approaching will here and distinguishing it from the sort of wants and desires of the personality. And so again, with this sort of solar-lunar relationship, we have the sun, which from our perspective never really changes. I mean, throughout the seasons, of course, it moves from more northern or southern latitudes, but it's not nearly as variable as the moon, which waxes and wanes, is invisible, and then is born again, with each month. So see, and the light of the moon, of course, is just the reflection of, well, the light of all the planets in our solar system is just the reflection of the sun's light. So similarly, the individual personality, the individual ego, reflects the light of the sun. And the further we walk on this path, and the more that the individual personality not only comes to understand the will, comes to learn how to connect to the will, and then that deeper structuring principle that informs everything that we are and everything that we do, the more directly and completely and without distortion we can reflect the light of the sun. And so that's, I think, one way of thinking about what this path is, because from some perspective, you can't help but do your will, and that will is the thing that determines everything that you are. But there is an ability to better reflect and to reflect more clearly that light that never changes. Yeah, let's just keep moving on here. I've got a whole bunch of slides here. We'll see how much we get through, how much we have time for. Go for about an hour and a half here. Yeah, so we'll just kind of go through what we've got here and see what happens. So a little detour into some Kabbalistic symbolism here. So I'm sure, as a lot of you know, the number 93 is quite important here. Sometimes, the tradition of Thelema is referred to as the 93 current. The idea that there are different sort of spiritual currents running within the broader, like Western esoteric or Hermetic tradition, whatever you want to call it. And that the 93 current is sometimes used as a synonym for the Thelemic tradition. And so the importance of this number 93 is derived from some what's called isopsophy, which is the Greek form of gematria or gematria. So again, in these two statements here that we already saw, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. We see the word will and love repeated here. And so in Greek, as we've already said, will is thelema, and love, or at least one of the words in Greek for love is agape. And so if we enumerate these words using isopsophy, the Greek system of enumerating words, we find that they both sum to the total of 93, which this actually wasn't even discovered by Crowley. It was discovered by one of his students, which of course was a really profound, striking confirmation of this message, and that the law of do what thou wilt, which is stated to be love, is really confirmed by this numerical analysis. And so 93 is often used as I said, we use these statements as greetings frequently, and 93 is often an abbreviation of that. And again, just emphasizing the deep identity of this concept of will with love, as Crowley says, the nature of this will is love. A few other kind of interesting things about 93 here. For those of you who know a little more about gematria and some of the numerical symbolism here, 93 is 31 times 3. 31 is an important number. It's the value of the Hebrew word El, which is also one of the titles of the Book of the Law, which is the text that these quotes are drawn from. It means God, and then also La, which is the inverse of the word El, which means not. And some of you will understand, I think, the significance of those two words. I've talked about that in some of the other classes that I've done here. Another interesting thing, and something that I think resonates with some of the themes we'll be talking about here, is that 93 is also the value of what are called the 3 reciprocal paths on the tree. So you see the tree of life diagram there. You may be able to see my cursor. The 3 what are called the reciprocal paths, or the horizontal paths. You have the upper path Daleth, central path Teth, and then the lower path here attributed to the letter Pe. Those 3 letters, Daleth, which has a value of 4, Teth, which has a value of 9, and Pe, which has a value of 80, added together sum to 93. And to the right of the tree there, you can see the astrological correspondences of these 3 letters. So Daleth corresponds to Venus, while Pe corresponds to Mars. And Mars and Venus, as I'm sure many of you know, have a very much a dyadic relationship within astrology. They're a kind of complementary pair. And then, so we can see their sort of union, the thing that is in the middle of this dialectic, is the path of Teth, which is attributed to Leo. And if we think about the tarot cards associated with that, especially in the Thoth deck, the Crowley-Harris deck, in the Lust card, we see the union of Babylon and the beast, which is almost a kind of union of Mars and Venus, this animal force united with the goddess Babylon. And so we'll be talking a little more about these different sort of dialectics and some of the Thelemic approach to reconciling and transcending the various forms of opposites. But we can see this pattern even right here in the number 93, which is really identical to the law of Thelema that we're talking about here tonight. All right, so just to go a little bit deeper here into what we mean by the law, let's look at a document that, again, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with. A document is Liber Oz. Oz is an interesting word in Hebrew. It is ayin zayin. It has a value of 77. Depending on how that word is given different vowel pointing, it can mean strength. It can also mean a goat, and it has a few other meanings as well. And the number 77 is also the value of the Hebrew word metzlah, which Crowley anyways interprets as the influence that descends from Kether, right? Kether is like the divine one. And so there's the idea of the sort of descending of that divine, the descending of kind of spiritual power from a divine source. So I encourage you to look up that number and the word to find more about it, but that's some of the basics there. And so Liber Oz, Crowley refers to this text as the rights of man. And of course, by man here, we mean all of humanity, regardless of sex or gender. Crowley is just using that, what now is kind of outdated language of using man as a universal category. So before the document there itself is on the right, but it's interesting also to look at a comment that Crowley made in a letter that he wrote to Wilkinson about this document. So he says, Rights of Man is an historical document. These items don't go easily on the tree, meaning he's not easily able to attribute them to the tree of life. But I've got them down into 5 sections: moral, bodily, mental, sexual freedom, and the safeguard tyrannicide. So let's read through this document, and then we can talk about these categories as we go on here. Let's see, I'm just rearranging my windows here. All right, so here we've got Liber Oz, Liber 77. A few quotes here from the Book of the Law, a couple of which we've already seen. The law of the strong. This is our law and the joy of the world. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. Do that and no other shall say nay. Every man and every woman is a star. Now this first, so there is no God but man. I think it's worth thinking about what exactly that statement might mean. People definitely interpret it in different ways. Anyways, I don't want to go too far down the sort of road to theology there, but I think it's worth giving some contemplation about what might be meant there, because I don't think it's simply a statement of some sort of atheism, nor do I think it's a statement about how humans are particularly identified with the divine more than other beings. I think I would interpret this anyways as a statement about a denial of a purely external God, right? That God or the divinity is not seen as something outside, some sort of force that sort of shouts down commandments at us, right? Don't eat the fruit of that tree or whatever, right? That we are seeing ourselves as not separate from the divine. That's how I would understand it, anyways. All right, so let's just take it sort of section by section here. So the first section here, this is what Crowley calls the moral section. So man, and again, man meaning all of humanity, man has the right to live by his own law, to live in the way that he wills to do, to work as he will, to play as he will, to rest as he will, to die when and how he will. So I think most of this is pretty straightforward. We have the moral freedom to live the lives that we choose to live, to work as we will, to play as we will, right? To live the lives of our own choosing and our own determining. The last line maybe needs a little more comment. Background noise, if you could please mute. Mute my volume for a second here. If you could please mute for now, that would be great. Let's see. So right. So this last one here, man has the right to die when and how he will. Now, obviously, I think this quite clearly includes the option of euthanasia, the decision to terminate life when in the face of terminal illness and all these other sort of things. Right, the right to die. I think we should think more critically about, and I don't really want to go too far down this road, but I think we should all think very clearly about sort of questions of suicide and things like that. And again, this is will. This isn't the simple desire. If we think that everything that we are as impermanent beings is determined by that will, that eternal and unchanging will, the question of when it would be in harmony with will to end a particular incarnation, I think we can come to sort of fairly definite conclusions about that. I'm thinking about this issue. I've always been inspired by some of the stories I've heard about Sora Merrill, Phyllis Seckler. Towards the end of her life, she was elderly. She was also in a lot of pain. She had arthritis in her spine, and she essentially realized that that she just couldn't do the work that she was here to do any longer. That her purpose in the body, this particular vehicle that she was in, had outlived its usefulness. And while she didn't take any like concrete action to end her life, I think she was had the sort of spiritual power and control over her own bodily and mental faculties, that she kind of put her affairs in order, and then fairly quickly just sort of departed this plane. And there's something I think really beautiful and graceful about that, about realizing that the individual body and personality, that was a vehicle for that will, was no longer able to reflect that will, and that she was no longer able to do her work, and sort of chose to let that incarnation end. Anyways, let's just keep moving on right now, but I think there's more to think about there. All right, so our next statement here, and this is what Crowley calls the bodily. Right, so Crowley says, man has the right to eat what he will, to drink what he will, to dwell where he will, to move as he will on the face of the earth. Again, I think pretty straightforward. Some ideas over here about immigration and things like that might be worth thinking about in relation to this. But overall, I think I think this is pretty straightforward. Let's see, in the third section here, mental. Man has the right to think what he will, to speak what he will, to write what he will, to draw, paint, carve, etch, mold, build as he will. To dress as he will, right? So we have freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of artistic expression and personal expression. And I think that should be pretty obvious. Now, number 4, sexual freedom. Man has the right to love as he will. And then there's a quotation here from the Book of the Law. Take your fill and will of love as ye will, when, where, and with whom ye will. And so while Crowley intended this love here to be understood in the sexual sense, we can also understand love in a broader sense as well, that we are free to love, sort of physically, romantically, platonically, whatever else, as we will. And then finally, and this is the one where people are often quite on board with this until we get to number 5 here. And Crowley says here, man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. But I think if we refer back to the letter there on the left, we can see what Crowley's intention was here. This is certainly not some statement that you can just sort of kill anyone that you feel is in any way obstructing your will, but he calls it the safeguard tyrannicide, right? Tyrannicide is, the killing of a tyrant, right? And so he's obviously not thinking of some sort of kind of James Bond License to Kill or something like that. But again, he's even calling it I think I wrote safeguard there, but should they say safeguard? He's thinking of a kind of like last resort in the case of kind of tyrannical ruler here, right? And so I think we can think about something like the French Revolution or something like that in this context. So anyways, there's just a little bit of elaboration here about the rights of humanity, what you are permitted to do. As we'll go on, we'll see that, that this law includes not only rights, what you're allowed to do, but also duties as well. Another thing I think that's worth repeating here or worth saying about this idea of the rights, as other commentators on Thelema have said before, that this is primarily not so much about the rights that you claim for yourself, but the rights that you grant to all other people, right? And so to assent to this isn't to say, oh, I have these rights, but that all humans have these rights. Let's see, Will Linden saying, as it was said elsewhere, when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Sure, I mean, that absolutely resonates with what's being said here, yeah. Let's see. Okay, so here's some selections of quotes, all from the Book of the Law, which is more formally known as Liber L or Liber Legis, again, which is just the Book of the Law in Latin. Now, this isn't a complete selection of quotes on this subject, but I think it's enough for our purposes here. But I would encourage you to, to read the entire text to get these statements in context, and to read other kind of subtler places within the text that's commenting on these ideas as well. All right, so again, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt. The law is for all. The word of the law is Thelema. The word of sin is restriction. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. Do that, and no other shall say nay. For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered from the lust of result, is every way perfect. If will stops and cries why, invoking because, then will stops and does not. Also take your fill and will of love as ye will, when, where, and with whom ye will, but always unto me. Now the me there, that's the goddess Nuit speaking in the first chapter there. Which, Crowley understood this idea, but always unto me. Crowley understood this as the idea that while any, sort of act of love was permissible, that the idea was that love was to be understood as a sacrament, not merely as a form of enjoyment for the individual personality, but as something with a sacred character. All right, and then finally, every man and every woman is a star, and again, love is the law, love under will. All right, so let's sort of shift gears here now. Start thinking about like some of the consequences of this, and to draw out some more of the implications. So I was going to originally talk a little bit more about kind of ethics, as like a branch of philosophy, but I've got a link there, and I'll share the slides both via YouTube and of course on our forum for members. I think it's worth, because we're talking about ethics, I think it's worth having a basic understanding of the philosophical discipline of ethics, and so that link is a great place to start. But we're not going to spend too much time worrying about that for reasons that you'll see here. But I do think that having that some basic context for the types of questions and conversations that have been going on within the Western philosophical tradition over the last like 2,500 years regarding ethics makes some nice kind of background and context for understanding what Crowley is saying here. So this is from a couple excerpts here from a short text of Crowley's called Postcards to Probationers. As some of you know, probationers of AA are beginners, right? So this is advice meant for people just starting out on the path. And so in this context, he has a number of other things to say, but he makes several comments about ethics and morality here. So first here he says, morality is immaterial, for both Socrates and Mohammed were Christs. Now, in this particular text, Crowley is using the word Christ basically as a synonym with an adept, someone who has realized the divine nature. That's just how he's using that word here. So he's saying that morality is immaterial to spiritual attainment, because both Socrates and Mohammed, had spiritual attainment and followed very different moral codes, right? I mean, Socrates was a pagan polytheist, frequently had sexual relationships with the beautiful young man of Athens, which Muhammad would not have approved of any of that, and yet nevertheless they both were spiritually realized adepts. Therefore, morality is immaterial. And then the next part here, we have a kind of three-part argument here. So one, since the ultimate truth of teleology is unknown, all codes of morality are arbitrary. So teleology is the study of ends, and in particular questions about philosophical questions about the ultimate purpose of the universe, so why, or the purpose of creation. Why all of this exists, right? And so Crowley's taking a kind of agnostic line here, right, and saying that we don't know the ultimate reason for existence. Therefore, all codes of morality are arbitrary. For any code of morality to be non-arbitrary, it would have to be grounded in an understanding of the purpose of existence. And since we don't have that, we can't ground a code of morality. I think there are maybe like stronger ways of making this sort of argument. I mean, there's some interesting like like arguments against there being any sort of teleology that don't just sort of descend into nihilism. For example, there's an argument, at least as far as I understand it, in Plotinus, that there could not be teleology, there couldn't be a purpose to the universe or like a goal that existence is aiming at, because that would imply that the one, the divine source lacked something and needed to create in order to achieve some end that it lacked. But since that's a kind of contradiction, couldn't possibly be the case, we should instead understand that the existence of separate things, the existence of the material universe, the existence of individual minds, all those sort of things, they must just be the kind of spontaneous overflow or expression of the fullness of divinity. And so that, so there's not some purpose to existence. It's just that everything that exists is part of the spontaneous expression of the fullness of the one. But anyways, however you want to make the argument, we're getting the kind of anti-teleological position here and saying that all codes of morality are arbitrary. So statement 2, therefore the student has no concern with ethics as such. So I think it's important here to see the value of the words as such, that we're not saying the student has no concern with ethics in the sense that it doesn't really matter what you do, it doesn't matter if you hurt other people, things like that. Rather, we're saying the student has no concern with like kind of philosophical debates about ethics, that the student doesn't need to be concerned with various ethical theories. So finally 3, he is consequently free to do his duty in that state of life to which it has pleased God to call him. In other words, you can simply do what thou wilt. And so again, instead of rejecting ethics here, I think we can see the various different ethical theories being not just thrown away, but sort of transcended, that we're going beyond, because of course, every particular ethical theory is always going to have maybe unwanted consequences, or it'll lead to certain sorts of contradictions. But the idea here would be that we're kind of dialectically transcending the various contradictions within the various ethical theories, that we are kind of leaping beyond them. But it's also a kind of freedom here, right? That there's a kind of freedom from having to ask these questions, and we can simply move on with actually understanding, our own nature and our own will, and doing that. Let's see, a question here from SR, says, loaded question, but is there any other moral philosophers in Thelema other than Crowley, but post-Crowley? In other words, have any other Thelemites tackled these questions or even questioned them? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think most Thelemic writers have addressed these sorts of ideas, in one place or another. I mean, everyone within sort of Temple of the Silver Star tradition, of course, Sora Merrill, Phyllis Segler had quite a bit to say about these sort of topics, and most other Thelemic writers, I'm sure, have said something. I wouldn't say that any Thelemites are moral philosophers. I mean, they tend to just sort of follow along with these sort of basic ideas about, at least as I'm interpreting it, Thelema sort of transcending moral philosophy as such, or moral philosophy in itself. But, again, no one's simply dismissing ethics. Has anyone disagreed with Crowley's moral approach, like in here? I mean, I think this is simply like kind of I mean, you could certainly disagree with aspects of Crowley's like moral or ethical ideas, but that wouldn't really be a fundamental disagreement right here, because the idea is that each person has to arrive at these conclusions for themselves. So that, while in particular cases you may disagree with Crowley, and certainly, I mean, there's a lot of particular statements that Crowley makes about all sorts of things, about politics and all kinds of stuff that I would certainly disagree with, but it's not a fundamental disagreement with the ethical theory in itself, or the sort of this theory of like transcending ethics. We don't need to agree with like particular statements of Crowley, right? Because we can understand that those particular statements are made by a particular person with a particular will, who was born at a particular time and place, and all these other sort of things that. To sort of disagree on that level would be, I think, to not really see, would be to sort of miss the point. Yeah. All right, so just an example here, one of many of the way that some of these ideas are applied in theory, or applied in practice, right? And so we can, for an example of I put ethics in quotation marks here because of what we just said, but here is a sort of Crowley statement about sexual ethics. So Crowley writes, the beast 666 ordains by his, the beast 666 is Crowley himself, of course, in his office as like the prophet. So he says, the beast 666 ordains by his authority that every man and every woman and every intermediately sexed individual. Now, intermediately sexed individual, I think in contemporary parlance, we would say like non-binary, right? So that every man, woman, and every human at all shall be absolutely free to interpret and communicate self by means of any sexual practices soever, whether direct or indirect, rational or symbolic, physiologically, legally, ethically, or religiously approved or no, provided only that all parties to any act are fully aware of all implications and responsibilities thereof and heartily agree thereto. So I don't think that requires a lot of comment, but I think it just shows the way that, or one example of the way that the law of Thelema is actually like put into practice in human relationships. And we'll come back to some of these ideas in just a little bit. All right, let's see. So I wanted to sort of shift gears here a little bit and look at, I think it can be useful sometimes to look at the ways that the ideas, that Thelemic ideas are criticized. I think an intelligent and perceptive critic can be like a really valuable thing. And so, while there's of course very shallow criticisms of this, ideas that, oh, do out thou wilt means, you can whatever, just go out and do terrible things, without consequence or something like that, or that it's a purely like selfish philosophy or whatever, or that it's evil, or right. I think it's worth looking at, more maybe critics who are a little more perceptive here, and so I think this kind of leads into to some of the other things that I wanted to talk about here. But I think we can contrast a better, deeper understanding here. So this is just an example from an essay by a guy named Paul Kingsnorth, he's an interesting writer. I definitely don't disagree with a lot of things that he thinks, but sometimes I don't know, I found him to be an interesting sort of person to disagree with. So anyways, in a larger statement here, a larger essay that he writes, he discusses the idea of do what thou wilt as a spiritual philosophy. So I'll just read what he says, and then I think we'll kind of look at how we might respond to the criticism that he's making here. So he says, both the scientific enterprise, and he's being very critical of the modern worldview. So both the scientific enterprise and the magical quest, which it was part of, right? Because he's referring to historically true ideas about the way that kind of modern science was connected to the emergence of that was connected to various kind of hermetic and esoteric currents like within the Renaissance. But anyways, it sprang from the same desire to know the world and to bend it to our will. Will in both cases is the key word. When Aleister Crowley, pioneering occultist, rampant self-publicist is a pretty good description of Crowley. Rampant self-publicist and self-described great beast created his own occult religion, Thelema, in the early 20th century. He gave it its own famous commandment, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Our world is, and then a little later he says, our world is still run by magicians, working from the sacred temples of their laboratories to discover how humanity may reshape the world in accordance with its will. So there's a criticism here, right, that that this theory of do what thou wilt means that you can impose your will on the world, that either individuals or humanity can just impose its will on the rest of existence, whether that's other, like living systems on the earth itself, or one group of humans on another, right? So Kingsnorth himself, he's a Christian. He goes on to contrast what he understands of the philosophy of do what thou wilt with a Christian perspective on the will of God. And so he ends up referring to this quote here from Luke, which is quite interesting, right? And so some of you, I'm sure, already know the context here. This is the agony in the garden when Jesus is in Gethsemane, and he realizes that he's about to be crucified. And so he goes away from the other disciples here, and I'll just read it. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Right, so he's saying, if thou be willing, please save me from having to be crucified, right? Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And so you can see the Greek of the portion in red there, not my will, but thine be done. And we can see the word, the will here is the word Thelema. And so I'll spare you my terrible Greek, but rendered very literally, this would be like, yet not the will of me, but of you be done, right? So there's a contrast here between my will or my Thelema and thy will or thy Thelema, right? And the sort of the Christian perspective would be of renouncing my will for the sake of the divine will. But I think, and as we'll try to develop here, that a properly Thelemic understanding is not to assert my will against the will of the divine, but to understand the non-separation of my will and the divine will. And so again, in this kind of dialectical mode here, instead of seeing the two wills, the will of the individual and the will of the divine, as opposed things that we need to choose between, and I think this is the mistake that Kingsnorth makes here, is he's still understanding Crowley's statement within this opposition between human will and divine will. But rather the properly Thelemic perspective is to see the non-difference of that and to leap over the distinction between my will and thy will. Let's see, Cassé, he seems to be interpreting will as want, the desire of the personality. Yeah, sure. But I think this. Right, but I think there's also this deeper thing about will as there being a contrast between the will of individual humans and the divine. It's a perspective that began because he's a Christian, that sees the divine as something outside and separate from humanity, that like imposes its will onto humanity by giving like laws and commandments and all this sort of thing. But that again, the properly Thelemic response isn't to sort of isn't to like reject the divine will in favor of our own, but to kind of short circuit the distinction and to identify the individual will with our own. And I think in the next few slides we'll try to develop that idea a little bit deeper here. All right, so this is from Liber Oz, which is one of Crowley's sort of short, more accessible statements about the nature of Thelema and the law of do what thou wilt. So let's see. Crowley says basically he's giving a kind of sort of formula or program for what living out do what thou wilt means. So he says, thou must 1, find out what is thy will. 2, do that will with A, one-pointedness, B, detachment, C, peace. Now this idea of like one-pointedness, detachment, and peace, this is an idea that we'll come back to a little bit later here. Yeah. He says, then and only then and then only art thou in harmony with the movement of things. thy will part of, and therefore equal to, the will of God. And since the will is but the dynamic aspect of the self, I think that's an interesting statement, right? That the will is the dynamic aspect of the self. That will is almost like something like true nature or deep nature, right? So that we can think that do what thou wilt almost means like be what you truly are. But instead of talking about you being something, we're talking about doing, right? So it's the dynamic aspect of the self. It's the truest, divine nature, but as it actually operates, as it does things rather than just is something. So the will is but the dynamic aspect of the self. And since two different selves could not possess identical wills, right, the idea being that if two selves possessed identical wills, they would actually just be the same self. And since two selves could not possess identical wills, then if thy will be God's will, thou art that. And so the thou art that there, that's a reference to the Chandogya Upanishad, where thou is referring to the Atman, the kind of what we might call the soul, not the personality, but the deeper, truer identity of the individual. And then that refers to Brahman, the absolute divinity beyond all categories that are, at least in the Advaita interpretation, are identical with each other. So for the moment, I just want to focus on this part that I highlighted in red there about if you do your will, you are in harmony with the movement of things. So I had wanted to talk about, and we're going to do it for a minute, talk about some of the relationships between Thelema and Taoism. Taoism was extremely influential on Crowley, and I think this is a fact that's sometimes overlooked about how influential Taoist thinking was to Crowley and how influential it was in his own development of his idea of what, of the idea of will and what do what thou wilt means. However, that's such a big topic that I think it'll deserve a class all on its own, which I'll plan to do at some point, maybe not next month, but sometime soon. We'll do a class about sort of Thelema and Taoism, and we can talk about the influence of Taoism, on Crowley's thought and some of the overlaps between Taoist and Thelemic philosophy, and the way that sort of Taoist philosophy can inform our understanding of Thelema. But for the moment, I just want to give you a quotation here from Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is a little bit later than Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, but he's still one of the most important kind of fundamental thinkers on Taoism. All right, so he says in this passage here, horses have hoofs to carry them over frost and snow, hair to protect them from wind and cold. They eat grass and drink water and fling up their heels over the prairies. Such is the real nature of horses. Right? We could even say such is the true will of horses. When pleased, they rub their necks together. When angry, they turn round and kick up their heels at each other. Thus far only do their natural dispositions carry them. But bridled and bitted, with a plate of metal on their foreheads, they learn to cast vicious looks, to turn the head to bite, to resist, to get the bit out of the mouth or the bridle into it, and thus their natures become depraved. Right? So at least one way of understanding what Zhuangzi is saying here is that horses on their own just sort of follow spontaneously their own natures, right? They do what they will when not interfered with. But when humans we interfere with them when we put bridles and bits on them, metal plates on their foreheads. That makes their natures depraved, right? And so it's not merely that their will is being restricted, that they're being prevented from doing what they will, but there's actually a kind of a distortion happening that not just interferes with them and harms them, but actually kind of changes the expression of their, or interferes, not just with them doing what they will, but interferes with the very ability to express their nature. And so I think this is one, this kind of resonates with a quote that we already saw here, right? The word of sin is restriction. And so again, I think we see here again in Zhuangzi that it's not just that it's wrong to restrict the natural being of something, but that the restriction of the sort of natural flow of things, or the movement of things, there actually creates different forms of disharmony and suffering. I think this also resonates with the ideas here from Rabelais. So Rabelais, as again, I'm sure some of you know, he was a 16th century writer living in France, who is very much a precursor to Thelema. And so in one of his texts, Rabelais' Pantagruel and Gargantua is a series of 5 books. They're contain a lot of different things. They're quite comical, irreverent, but also contain quite a bit of wisdom as well. And so in the course of one of these, in Gargantua, the giant Gargantua ends up forming a kind of it's a kind of like anti-monastic order. Rabelais himself had been a member of, well, actually, he was a member of both the Franciscans and the Dominicans at different periods, but was quite critical of the monasteries and the monastic systems. And so where the lives of Christian monks were incredibly regimented. There was all kinds of rules that they had to follow, and even their daily schedules were extremely regimented by the hours. So in this text here, there's a kind of anti-monastic order founded here that he calls the Abbey of Theleme, right, or the Abbey of Thelema, and he refers to the order of, and he calls this sort of monastic order that he invents the Order of Thelemites. And so here's a quotation here from that text. So he's talking about the Order of Thelemites. Their whole life was ordered not by laws, rules, and regulations, but according to their volition and free will. There was but one clause in their rule, right? The rule there is like the rule of a monastic order. So there was but one clause in their rule: do what thou wilt. Because people who are free, well-bred, well-taught, and conversant with honorable company have by nature an instinct, a goad, which always pricks them towards virtuous acts and withdraws them from vice. They call it honor. When such as they are oppressed and enslaved by base subordination and constraint, that noble disposition by which they were with frankness striving towards virtue, they deflect towards casting off and breaking down that yoke of bondage, for we all engage in things forbidden and yearn for things denied. So the reference to yoke of bondage there is a reference to a concept in Christianity sometimes referred to as like Pauline freedom. I'm not going to go into it here, and I'm definitely not an expert on it, but it's sort of worth looking into. It refers to, I think it's from Galatians. Yeah, anyways, the particular kind of topic in Christian theology about the extent to which Christians are subject to law. And then the second quotation for we all engage in things forbidden and yearn for things denied, that's a quotation from Ovid. Right, and so we can see here this idea that when left to do their will, the people who are free and well-bred and well-taught, they naturally follow a path of honor. But the restriction of will not merely stops them from doing certain things, but again, in a similar sort of way that what Zhuangzi was saying there, that it actually creates the desire for the things forbidden, and so it distorts their nature, not merely prevents them from doing something, but actually sort of warps and distorts them. And so we can almost say a kind of Taoist intention here in Rabelais that people will be most virtuous when left to follow their natural inclinations. Yeah. And so again, do what thou wilt Rabelais isn't simply using it here as just some sort of statement of absolute permissiveness, but as an actual, because Rabelais, for all his criticisms of the church and theology and philosophy, he does remain a Christian, and I think understands that, or he believes that, if given this kind of freedom, it would actually make people more virtuous rather than less, and that they would be able to follow an undistorted path. All right, so we've been talking for almost an hour here, so I should definitely keep moving along here. But again, I think this resonates very interestingly and gives I think suggests perhaps deeper interpretations of this quotation from the Book of the Law, right? That the word of sin is restriction. Here we go. Okay, and so kind of resonating against with some of these Taoist ideas and ideas about nature here. I just wanted to read a quotation here from Crowley's Little Essays Towards Truth, where he speaks about nature and again returns to some of these questions about morality and ethics. So yeah, I'll just read it. All the moral codes of mankind, for all their absurd diversities, have one common factor. They pretend to have found motives and methods which are superior to nature's. That is, they presume a conception of the end which is beyond her view. They assert the possession of an intelligence loftier than that which has produced the universe. Consider only that the highest manifestation possible to the rational mind is the discovery of the laws which summarize her manner of operation. We may then say at once that all such pretentious arrogance is impudence and absurdity. Just stop there. You can read the rest of the quotation for yourself, and I'll make the slides available for everyone. But again, the point here, just sort of returning to this idea about ethics and morality, that Crowley's put forth the idea here that any human code of ethics or morality pretends to be superior to nature or to have a form of wisdom or knowledge that is superior to nature. And so again, in this Taoist, I think, sort of mode, we can think about the idea that simply following nature is, the kind of form. There's no need for codes of ethics or morality, and there's no need for ethical philosophy. It's simply following the way of nature, or in Taoist language, following the Tao, following the flow of things or the movement of things, which includes both our own inner natures as well as any natures outside of ourselves that we're relating to. And so by doing our will, we're not imposing our will on the world, but we are moving with the will of all things. Again, coming back to that criticism we talked about earlier, about human will being imposed on the world as distorting and changing things, rather the idea that doing what you will moves in harmony with the will of all things and with the flow of all things. Rather than your will being sovereign or superior to other wills, but rather in harmony with them. All right, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so and just to come back to this quote that we saw a few moments ago here, right? So then and only then art thou in harmony with the movement of things. And I'm certain that by movement of things, especially the capitalization, Crowley, I'm sure, is absolutely thinking about the Tao. And so this next part of the sentence there, thy will part of and therefore equal to the will of God, right? And so there's an identity with, again here, this identity being made between the will of the individual and the will of the divine, that I think we can, I think we can draw out a little bit further here. So Crowley already has that one argument there about the will being, if thy will be God's, then thou art that. So I thought this kind of resonated nicely with some ideas from more traditional forms of Hermeticism. So in the Corpus Hermeticum, which I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with here, in the 16th book there, we have the following quotation. The Father of all is God, their craftsman is the sun, and the cosmos is the instrument of craftsmanship. Intelligible essence governs heaven, heaven governs the gods, and demons. Now, demons here this is daimones in Greek, something more like spirits, and we're not talking about any kind of evil power or anything like that. And demons posted by the gods govern humans. They were seen in this kind of traditional Hermetic thought as intermediaries between the gods and the events here on Earth. And demons posted by the gods govern humans. This is the army of gods and demons. Through them, God makes everything for himself, and all things are parts of God. But if all things are parts of God, then all things are God. And he makes himself in making all things. His making can never cease because he is ceaseless. And as God has no end, so his making has neither beginning nor end. So I think there's a number of really beautiful and interesting things here. One, we have this idea of a self-creating, a God that is self-creating, right? That he makes himself in making all things, and that he is without beginning or end. And these ideas of a self-created being, a being without beginning and end, is often symbolized in Hermetic and alchemical the tradition by the Ouroboros, the serpent swallowing its tail. And there on the right, from the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, we see one kind of classic depiction of the Ouroboros there. And in the center in Greek, it says hen to pan, one and all. But again, this idea that all things are parts of God, and therefore all things are God. And so I think this, I think this just really resonates with that idea that that we've just been talking about. Yeah, let's see. So, again, this idea, if all things are parts of God, then all things are God. And then from the Corpus Hermeticum and Crowley's statement, thy will part of and therefore equal to the will of God. Now, I want to keep moving here. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but this is, you might recognize parts of this slide from other presentations that I've given if you've attended any of those. But I think this is a really nice way of potentially of thinking about it, in a very modern, I think, way of thinking about it, is to think of this as a kind of like fractal or holographic sort of way of thinking about the relationship between the individual and the divine, and thinking about the the Hermetic maxim of as above, so below. That the part is identical to the whole. Now, in fractal terms, right, we have a kind of self-similarity of parts, that no matter how far you zoom into a fractal, the individual piece, no matter how small, will always have the same structure as the whole. And so I think that's another way that we can talk about the relationship between the individual and the divine, that each individual is like a fractal, a fragment of the divine that has that same structure as the divine. Or, in terms of holography, if you take a hologram and break it into pieces, each fragment of the hologram will display the complete original image, but just from a particular range of points of view. So like if you imagine the two images on the left there are just the same hologram photographed from two different angles. But if we imagine them as a holograph that's been broken into pieces, rather than like one half of the hologram having the mouse's head on it and the other half having its butt or whatever, instead each piece of the hologram will show the entire image of the mouse, but just from different perspectives, right? Because the hologram, as you move it, like the image rotates. So the different pieces won't contain the full range of rotation, but it will have the entire image. And so if you think that we are all, and no matter how small you break the pieces down into, so if each one of us is like a kind of holographic fragment of the totality or of the divine, each one of us will contain the complete and total image of the divine will, but from a particular perspective. And that is one way of thinking of how, if my will is God's will and your will is God's will, why is my will different than your will? It's that each individual could be thought of as one particular image or one particular perspective on the totality of the divine will. Yeah, I think that's worth thinking about. I just want to move on here, but I think that's a really nice kind of image, or I found it a very helpful way of thinking about some of these ideas. All right, so we've talked already about rights, and about freedom, but we can also talk about sort of the duties. We saw that quote already. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. So I think to kind of use astrological symbolism again, we can think of another dyad here. This time between Jupiter and Saturn. And so using Jupiter to represent freedom, what we've been talking about is like the rights of man, and then Saturn to refer to responsibility and duties. And again, like all dyads, there are a complementary pair. And so we have two different ways of sort of looking at do what thou wilt. One is what do you have the freedoms to do, as we've already developed, and then also what do you have the responsibility or the duty to do. And along these lines, Crowley says in the Message of the Master Therion, do what thou wilt is the apotheosis of freedom, but it is also the strictest possible bond, right? And so we'll develop this idea further on the next couple of slides. But at least a basic way of thinking about this here is that, although you have the absolute freedom to do your will, you're not allowed to do anything other than your will, so that you have a kind of a freedom from the sort of restrictions that we've been talking about. But in some sense, you are bound to do your will, and you have the duty to do your will. Or we might say in other terms, you have the duty to sort of be who you are. You have a duty to express your nature, whatever that happens to be. This isn't the kind of freedom of you can sort of be whatever you want. You can choose your will or something like that. There is a divine will that pre-exists and is kind of metaphysically prior to the individual ego. And once you have discovered that, sort of the whole purpose of your life from that point on, and everything that you do is to be increasingly dedicated to the expression of that thing that you have discovered, and it is your duty to do that. Right? You do not have the freedom. You have the freedom to do whatever it is that you discover your will to be, but you do not have the freedom to decide that you don't want to do your will, or that you want your will to be something different than it is. And that can be difficult. I mean, maybe not everyone will necessarily have this experience, but some people may have the experience of having insight into what their will is, and maybe realizing that that's not completely in line with all of their ego desires. Maybe they imagined that they would have a certain career, or maybe their reasons for getting involved in something ends up being something that's not fully in line. So this isn't merely about renouncing kind of desires for things, but also about renouncing the conceptions that your ego, your personality has formed about itself in the face of something higher and deeper than that. And that can be a painful and difficult process sometimes. So while there is something joyful and liberating about this law, right, and that would be a kind of Jupiter aspect of it, there is a kind of heaviness to it, and perhaps the sense of like a burden of this would be like the more the Saturnian kind of aspect of it. And ultimately those two things should resolve, and we should move beyond that. But it can take work, and it can take time to arrive at that place. Let's just keep moving on here. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of conception of individuality. We've already developed this idea a little bit, but I just wanted to go a little bit further and to bring in some particularly like Thelemic symbolism. So we can talk about some of the deities drawn from the Book of the Law and from the Stelae of Revealing. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with what the Stelae of Revealing is. If not, you can definitely look it up. I don't really have time to go into the full explanation of it now, but it's an Egyptian funeral stele that was very important in it becomes a kind of visual synthesis of the Book of the Law, and was extremely important in the revelations that Crowley had that led to his reception of the Book of the Law. And we see on it the three like divine persons, the three deities that are most important to the Book of the Law. So we see the star goddess Nuit arched above the whole scene. Beneath her, the winged solar disk Hadit. And then on the left there, on the throne, we have Ra Horquit, who is a kind of form of both Ra and Horus. So just for a moment here, I want to talk about particularly about Nuit and Hadit and the way that those deities are understood in the context of Thelema. So this first quotation at the top here, this is Hadit speaking here in chapter 2. He says, "In the sphere, I am everywhere the center, as she," referring to Nuit, "as she, the circumference, is nowhere found." So below that, I've just sort of thrown out some of my own words about ways that we can conceptualize Nuit and Hadit. So Nuit is the Nuit, the star goddess. She is all of pictured as the entire cosmos, the starry cosmos, all the stars and the spaces between it. And she's all and nothing, the infinite zero. Again, that the circumference that is nowhere found within the infinite sphere. I think we can talk about her wisdom as the wisdom of no difference, the wisdom of the sort of the non-separation of all things. And we can say that she represents everything. And then her complement, her lover, is Hadit, who is the core of every star. He is the infinitesimal point, where she is the kind of the zero of the totality. He is the zero of the infinitesimal small point, the individual point of view. Again, the center that is everywhere, the omnipresent center. Within an infinite sphere, right? Every point in an infinite sphere would be the center of that sphere, because it would all be equally distant from the infinitely distant circumference. And so Hadit here, where Nuit represents non-difference, Hadit, we could say, represents uniqueness, the uniqueness of the individual or the individual will. And so where Nuit is everything, Hadit is anything. So, this diagram that I've made here, I'm basing this on, there's an essay by Crowley, and we'll see some quotations from it on the next slide here, called Duty. And you should go and read the essay for yourself. But a really interesting thing that he does in it is he talks about, again, this is sort of the talking about the duties that are implied by the Law of Thelema. And again, as a kind of complement to the rights or the freedoms implied by the law. And he does it in a really interesting way where he breaks it into 4 sections. So in the first section, you have the duty to yourself. In the second section, the duty to other, I think he says the duty to other men and women. In the third, he talks about the duty to mankind. And then in the fourth, the duty to, I think, to all things whatsoever, or I forget exactly how he phrases it. And so I don't think we need to worry too much about the particular way that he puts these categories. But I think the thing that's really interesting is that he starts with the individual and then gradually expands the sphere until we get to the whole. And so we have 2 intermediate levels here, which I wanted to kind of play off of them slightly in my own sort of way. And I think we can all sort of reflect on the way that Crowley does this and come to our own sort of understandings of these things. So the way I sort of put it here is, right, in the center, we have the self, the individual self, which, at its core, at its divine core, is represented by the Thelemic deity Hadit, or is this deity Hadit. And then broadening out a little bit to the next concentric sphere, we have other persons. Now, I think there's, I don't necessarily want to get into it, but I think of there being non-human persons, other living beings. I conceive as persons. Crowley doesn't think that way, and that's absolutely a difference that I think can exist within Thelema, and there can be a lot of room for conversation about personhood and how we conceive of personhood. But however you want to understand it, we now have the relationships in the application of the law to other persons. Then beyond that, we start to get to whether humanity itself, to society, to ecosystems, possibly to like our planet. And then beyond that, we have the whole and the totality of the cosmos, which is the goddess Nuit. And so, again, as we said, that ultimately, Nuit is all things, right? That each sphere here is contained within the one larger than it, but is still kind of sovereign on its own plane or from its own point of view, right? So we're not subordinating the individual self to these other things, but just understanding that the law applies at all of these different scales, from the whole to the individual and to stages in between. Yeah, let's just move on to the next slide here. So here's a few quotations here from the book Duty. So let's see. So Crowley says this first quotation here refers largely to the second sphere here, the relationships with other persons. So Crowley says, abstain from all interference with other wills. To seek to dominate or influence another is to seek to deform or to destroy him, and he is a necessary part of one's own universe, that is, of oneself. So for example, when we have this idea of non-difference, of understanding that other individuals are not actually separate from yourself, and that therefore we should refrain from interfering with the wills of others because those others are recognized to be not separate, right? Again, this idea that humans, or an individual human or humanity as a whole, can simply impose its will on others or on other things would be to act from a point of separation, to think of ourselves as fundamentally different from the rest of the world, or to think of yourself as fundamentally different from other people. And so we don't need a kind of ethical or moral theory about the importance of not harming other people, but we can simply realize that in the ultimate reckoning, there are no other people, that everything is non-separate and that everything is part of myself. And when I realize that, selfish action becomes, not morally wrong, but just sort of stupid, right? To harm another in order to help myself I can only be taking that action because I see myself as fundamentally different from other things, which is mere ignorance, right? When I understand that other people or other beings are not separate from what I am, it's simply it's simply sort of stupidity or ignorance to think that it would be a good idea to harm other people in order to help yourself, right? That's that kind of separative point of view. Crowley goes on here to say, to establish the law of Thelema as the sole basis of conduct. And so again, we can think of this as talking about humanity, or as about talking about our relationship to ecosystems and things like that, right? That all of these questions should be understood through the law of Thelema. And I think this becomes not something that we have to intellectually understand at the beginning of the path, but a kind of constant meditation and reflection that we can do whenever any situation comes up in your own life, or if you're sort of reading the news or thinking about the state of the world. Really, ask yourself, like, can the law of Thelema solve this problem? I've been thinking about this for over a decade now, and really trying to understand, like, does it really cover all situations? Can we really solve all of these problems by application of the principle, do what thou wilt? Can you really imagine do what thou wilt as the sole basis of all conduct, whether individual conduct, relationship with other people, and even the ways that societies or ecosystems or all these other sort of things operate? Can you think of all of these things as, do you need any other principles beyond do what thou wilt? I think that's a question we can all sort of continuously ask ourselves as we're walking this path. All right, and then finally, in this essay, he says, it is a violation of the law of Thelema to abuse the natural qualities of any animal or object by diverting it from its proper function, as determined by consideration of its history or structure. So again, I think we can think back to the quote from Zhuangzi there, about the will or nature of horses there, and the ideas of restriction, right? And so it's a violation of the law of Thelema to abuse the natural quality of anything at all, whether human or non-human. And again, I think this brings us back to that idea of imposing our wills on other things, that we recognize everything to have a will, everything that is at least a proper object. We might sort of wonder whether, like, a kind of human-made artifacts, like a chair or something like that, really have the wills. But at least the way I conceive of it is that any sort of self-regulating or self-sustaining organic system can be thought of as having a will. That you don't necessarily have to follow that particular way of conceiving of it, but I've found that to work sort of quite well in principle. So again, Crowley says, the law of Thelema is to be applied unflinchingly to decide every question of conduct. Let's see, SR suggesting forming a Thelemic speech and debate club. Sure, I think a lot of Thelemic organizations often have that as part of their function. I think being participating in conversations, about these things with other people can certainly be an excellent way, and listening to the challenges of other people, whether those other people are also, following the Thelemic path, or people who aren't following the Thelemic path. Formal debates, yeah, sure. I mean, that's not something that I would be extremely interested in, but if that's something other people wanted to do, that could certainly be quite productive. And again, I think it's not about proving to other people these sort of things. I mean, that might be a way of developing our own ideas by engaging in formal debate. But I think this is ultimately something that we all have to do for ourselves. But yeah, that's certainly something that people might find beneficial. Apparently, that's happening on Discord. There you go. All right, so let's see. In the remaining few minutes we have here, I just wanted to do, a couple more things. So one thing I just wanted to touch on this briefly. There's a quotation from the Book of the Law here that you see at the top in red. Compassion is the vice of kings, which I have frequently seen in the Thelemic world interpreted as the idea that that Thelema or the Thelemic philosophy is somehow against compassion, or that compassion is somehow anti-Thelemic or something like that. And so while I don't want to give you an interpretation of this verse, I just wanted to suggest a few, sort of resonances with some of the words in that verse here that might suggest some deeper or more sophisticated ways of thinking about it. So first, the word compassion here. And I think, one thing, first of all, I think is to make a distinction between compassion and pity. Certainly, I think pity implies a position of superiority. It implies, a kind of position of superiority, maybe even a sort of a position that what's happened to someone else shouldn't really be, or something like that you might pity someone who's had some sort of misfortune, who hasn't been able to achieve the life that they were supposed to have, or something like that. And so I think we can certainly be critical of that sort of position, especially the implied superiority or separation involved in taking pity on others. But I think that's not what's meant by compassion, but rather, as actually Crowley does develop or is developed in The Vision and the Voice, the idea of compassion as a kind of sacrament, as literally compassion literally means like suffering with, but a kind of participation in the sufferings of others. And again, I think this goes back to some of those ideas of non-separation, of not seeing yourself as separate from other beings. But I think there's some other kind of Kabbalistic stuff that we can draw out of this as well. One thing which is quite interesting is that an alternate name of the Sephirah, Tifereth, right? Tifereth means beauty, and some of the Sephirah have alternate names, in the Kabbalistic tradition here. And one of these is Rahamim, which means compassion, right? So compassion is actually a name for an alternate name for this Sephirah. And the sphere Tifereth is associated, in particular, like in the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, is associated with the sun. And both Tifereth and the sun, as one of their kind of magical images, is the image of a king, right? So we see Tifereth both being associated with compassion and also associated with kings, which I think is really interesting here. With this statement that compassion is the vice of kings, right? You have this way of Kabbalistically linking the ideas of compassion and kingship here, which I think suggests, at least partially, that maybe this phrase doesn't simply mean that compassion is like the failing of kings or something like that, or is an error or flaw in kings, but that something much deeper is being spoken of here. Let's see. So, and then we have a quotation here from chapter 2, and I think this quotation is important in itself, but it's also quite important to realize that these two quotations, compassion is the vice of kings, and the one at the bottom here, are the only appearance of the word vice in the Book of the Law are contained in these two quotations. So if we're wondering about the idea of vice, or what the concept. I mean, I think there's a very real question of asking like what the concept of vice could possibly mean in the context of everything we've been talking about with the word of sin being restriction and all these other sort of ideas. What could vice possibly mean? And so in chapter 2, here we read, "Veil not your vices in virtuous words. These vices are my service. Ye do well, and I will reward you here and hereafter." So again, I think you can reflect on this for yourself, and I don't want to interpret it for anyone else. But I will also point out here that the word "these vices are my service." Note that the word vice is part of the word service. The last 4 letters in service are V-I-C-E, right? Vice. "These vices are my service" is one way that could potentially be read. So there you go. Actually, just one more thing I'll say about that. Crowley in the Laws for All talks about the idea that at least one way that we could understand the idea of compassion as a vice is that, at least to a certain extent, feeling compassion for another is kind of thinking of ourselves as different than others. And so it becomes a kind of vice, a kind of indulgence in like thinking of ourselves as separate. Which is a kind of interesting way of potentially conceiving of vice. I don't know that needs to be the final and ultimate interpretation of this, but it's one way that we might start to sort of think about this issue. But anyways, this is just my little plea for, I don't know, a more sophisticated and well thought out interpretations of this verse. Anyways, I invite you to sort of reflect on that, on your own further. All right, and then finally, following up on the word service here, I just wanted to mention relationships between the Thelemic path and the discipline of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga, again, is one of the 4 main branches of the yogic tradition, at least as we most commonly discuss it. And karma, I'm sure most people, all of you know the kind of standard uses of the word karma. It's often used to mean like the consequences of actions, right? People are going, oh, karma will get them or something like that, right? Which is just a kind of like importing of Christian morality or sort of an imposition of Christian morality onto like an Eastern system that really has nothing to do with that idea, right? Karma is not a moral sort of thing here, but rather karma literally means action. And we can think of it as an action that includes its result as well. So rather than being a kind of like moral force that punishes people for wrongdoing, it's simply action and the result of action understood as a kind of single thing. And so karma yoga is a yogic path and the path of action. And one, there's a lot in Karma Yoga and a lot of really useful and interesting concepts. I just wanted to quote here from kind of the root of the Karma Yoga tradition, which is part of the Bhagavad Gita. And so just 2 verses here from the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Gita already, but this is the god Krishna speaking to Arjuna. And so he says, therefore, without attachment, perform action that is to be enacted. Indeed, by performing action without attachment, a person attains the supreme. And then a slightly later verse. As the ignorant act attached to action, O Bharata, Bharata is just referring to Arjuna here. So the wise should act without attachment, desiring to act for the welfare of the world. So a few different ways that we can think about the essence of the Karma Yoga path. One way is often formulated as the renunciation of the fruits of action, that we simply act in the way that our karma dictates, or we act in Thelemic terms, we might say we act in accordance with our will, but renounce the fruits of action. That we act not in order to achieve some end, but we simply act in order to do what it is that we must do. Or again, in Thelemic terms, we simply act in accordance with our will, without desiring any particular aim for ourselves or without trying to avoid any particular consequences for ourselves. But we act in this detached sort of way, without attachment to the results of action, but acting simply in the way that we must because we must act that way. Sometimes there's also a more devotional kind of theological way of understanding this too, which is the giving over of the fruits of action to the God, of seeing the fruits of our actions, although we may enjoy them and receive them, seeing them as a kind of sacrifice to the divine, or sort of given over to the divine. And I think this resonates very deeply with the quotation here we have from the Book of the Law that said, "For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered from the lust of result, is every way perfect." And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the idea with the lust of result, but that's understood, by Crowley and other Thelemic thinkers very much as the idea of attachment to the fruits of action, of wanting some particular outcome, but rather, as we saw in that quotation a little while ago from Crowley about, once you know what your will is, you must do that will with one-pointedness, detachment, and peace, right? That we do our will without hoping for success, without attaching to success, without lusting for a particular outcome, but simply doing our wills because it is our will, and sort of letting things happen in accordance with the movement of things, with the flow of the Tao, with the will of the divine flowing through all things. All right, so that really brings me to the end of the formal portion here. Let's see, we're at just about an hour and a half, which is not bad for me, I think. So maybe I'll just say a couple more things here, and then if anybody wants to turn on their microphones, I'd be happy to hear comments, or feel free to just continue typing in the chat or whatever. But I think in all of this sort of stuff, I've tried to sort of unpack some of the consequences of this and this as a philosophical sort of idea. But ultimately, the only real question for anyone walking this path is what is thy will? What is it that you will to do? There are other, for example, like in Living Thelema, David Shoemaker has talked a lot or written a lot about about exercises for coming to understand your own will, for understanding your own nature, different kind of games that you can play for helping you to understand, who you are, and what your nature is and what your purpose is. But I hope that also this more slightly more kind of abstract or theoretical approach also gives a lot of context for thinking about this idea, and that we can see that thinking about my will as like a particular goal that needs to be accomplished, or as like a profession that I'm supposed to be part of, that all of these ideas are very partial and limited, and not really capturing the idea here, which is a sort of a total path. And I think it's also important to recognize that, while of course we refrain from interfering with the wills of others or restricting the wills of others, we should also recognize that in some sense, nothing can ever truly prevent you from doing your will. In any circumstance, no matter what, you are always able to do your will. Even if you were to be, put in imprisoned or put in solitary confinement, you could still find a way to express will within the context of that circumstance. We're always acting within limitations, right? We're not omnipotent, right? And so no matter what the social situation, no matter what our financial situation or anything else, within that context, the path of our wills is always available. And I would invite you to think about not just to merely contemplate, what your will might be, but also to reflect on your own actions and to reflect on, in particular cases where it's clear what you need to do in any given circumstance, thinking about what that says about your own nature. Think of examples where you just couldn't possibly have chosen anything different than what you did, right? About a situation where there's just no other option, right? There's very clearly just one path. There's one thing you had to do, right? All of those things can be clues about the nature of your own will, and about actions that you had to take simply because that was the action that you had to take. Let's see a few questions coming in here. Yeah, thanks everybody. let's see, there's a request for a Discord link here. Yeah, sure, you can go ahead and share the Discord link. That's fine. Let's see. A comment here from Joshua says, sure, we may have a small scale continuous insight in doing from day one before an hour has struck upon the bell, but certainly K&C is a major crisis or turning point, continuity of mountain with landscape, peak experience. Sure, right, and it is an unfolding path. We can begin to think about these things, and I imagine that all of you may not have full conscious understanding of it, but you all, I'm sure, to some degree already understand what your will is. You may not fully understand the degree to which you understand that, but it's not going to be, I think, something that's completely foreign or completely different than the way that you've conceived yourselves to be. It may be things that are kind of hidden in plain sight or something like that, but this is absolutely something that we can all do and all, I think, have done. Anyone who's asked questions about what it is that they really want, what it is that they truly value, they've already begun to ask these sort of questions. Anyone who has, and I assume this is everyone listening to this talk, who's done something other than simply follow, what they've been told to do by others, but has asked true, deep questions about what it is that they want to do with their lives, or what it is that they will to do with their lives, has already begun, to set foot on this path. And sure, just like Joshua here was just saying, there are, can be, even before K&C, there can be particular moments of revelation where suddenly something might sort of dawn on you all of a sudden, or occur to you, in a flash of insight. There is also just this gradual path of deeper and deeper understanding and insight into your own nature, into the nature of other beings and people in the world, and all of these things are clues to your own will. Let's see. Yeah, the 1 = 10 experience. Yeah, absolutely, Joshua. Yeah. Let's see, Ashera says, how would the ego affect that? I think it may alter your perception of your true will until you really figure out your true self. Sure, and we can certainly be wrong. That is absolutely the case. We can have misconceptions that need to be clarified as we go along. The ego can certainly, or the personality, whatever, can certainly, be separated from the will, or unaware of the will, or have a kind of limited momentum in some other direction that will eventually need to be corrected. I mean, that's certainly the case. Yeah, and that's, I think, again, that's a kind of constant path of correction, of understanding better and better, and then being able to aim sort of more and more accurately in the direction of will, of constantly sort of directing and redirecting the ego towards that thing. And it is a constant path. I mean, there's even once you have some conscious understanding of it, you'll still sort of fall away from it. Perhaps, Crowley talks about this too, that he constantly falls, from his own will, that he constantly fails to live up to, the full kind of divine majesty of that will. But just accepting that is the nature of the ego. As individual, impermanent selves, we are imperfect, and we will never, achieve that sort of perfection, at least from our perspective. Of course, from a certain perspective, everything is always perfect. But yeah, anyways, I hope that's helpful there. Let's see, a few more comments coming in here. We are tasked to know thyself and to have to peel away the layers of our upbringing and society's expectations. Yeah, absolutely. And I like that language of peeling away. It suggests a kind of like a purification process of, a nice Thelemic way of thinking about the idea of purification, right, is of being pure, not in like some sort of moral sense of purity, but like almost more of a chemical sense of purity, of just being nothing other than what you are. And that, family and society and all sorts of other things have introduced impurities into the personality, and we need to purify the personality so that you are only yourself, without that sort of admixture from other forces that would seek to divert you in some other direction than your will. Yeah, refinement process, right, so Szymanski? Let's see, a few more comments coming in here. let's see, Jason says, meditation is really key for me because the personality ego is going to scream in my ear, but to do as I will takes some real listening skills because it's basically bubbling up from my unconscious most of the time. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of saying it. And yeah, certainly meditation can be an extremely powerful practice in gaining that kind of clarity or that purification process. And yeah, I really like the way you phrased it too about listening, that the will being a kind of inner, an inner voice that speaks, right? And I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of these images of like the voice in the silence, right? That's, I think, another way of thinking about will. It's a kind of silent voice that is always speaking, and that it's not that it's something distant from us or far away, but something that we need to sort of go out and find, but rather we just need to learn how to listen to that thing that is speaking to us all the time. Yeah, listening for the HGA, right? And I would encourage you to think about this too as listening, not only like an inner listening, but also listening to the world, the apparently external world. One way of understanding the Hermetic principle of as above, so below would be something like as within, so without. And so understanding that the outside world is, in a sense, a reflection of the inner world, or they're kind of the inner and outer worlds are mutual reflections of each other. And so it may be that you have insights into the nature of your will, not simply by contemplating who you are and what your inner nature is, but also by listening to the world and listening to the actions that seem to be called forth by the world. I think I was starting to get to this idea a little bit about saying, think about situations where you couldn't have chosen any differently than you did. Your experience may not have been of it being, oh, it's my will to, whatever, save this baby that's fallen into the pool or something like that. You simply did it, or whatever, right? And if asked like, oh, why was it your will to, to save the baby from that had fallen into the pool or whatever, you might think, well, it wasn't my will to do that. It was just like, of course I was going to do that or something like that, right? But I think that should be understood as an expression of will. I mean, that's maybe a kind of silly or overly dramatic example, but we can all, I'm sure, find similar or sorts of examples in our lives. And we might not understand that as something coming from ourselves, but rather just as something that the world called us to do. But if we, if we understand inner and outer as mutual reflections of each other, we can understand that as I think a way of a moment where we're actually in full connection and full flow with our will, but we're just not recognizing it as ours, right? That we were thinking of it as something that's merely a call from the external world as to what the external world needs. But when we start to break down that distinction between internal and external, I think it becomes clear that those are moments of will and of following will, or following the Tao, following the movement of things, right? Of doing, of engaging that action of that karma yogic path, of doing what must be done, simply because it's what must be done. Some references, some memes. I'm the universe experiencing itself. I'm not familiar with that meme, but yeah, the universe experiencing itself can certainly be a nice way of conceiving of individual identity. Yeah. Yeah, no problem. All right, so unless there are any other comments or anything like that, that brings us to the end of our presentation for tonight. For more information about our work, please visit tots.org/FAQ for some good information about our order and our work. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free to email me. That's my address, is the provost of the academic track, provost@tots.org. And as always, we have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of either our academic or our initiatory tracks. If you'd like to make that donation, and thank you, you can send that to PayPal via PayPal to payments@tots.org. So yeah, thanks everybody. I'll get this posted up on YouTube in the next couple of days. And I will post a link to the slide deck here for anyone who would like it in the description of the YouTube video. And I'll also put that on the forum in the usual place there. So yeah, thanks everybody. I appreciate you being here, and yeah, keep an eye out for announcements of next month's class. Will be the first evening, the same time, first evening of the first Monday in March. So yeah, thanks everybody. 93s, great to see you all.